This is a DEFCON 1 emergency. They've launched the missiles. We have to respond now.
What if the world had ended on a Saturday? Not in fire and fury, as the poets once imagined, but in silence, in ash, in the slow, terrible realization that history had reached its final page and no one would be left to remember how it ended. October 27th, 1962, Black Saturday, the day humanity came within a single vote of annihilation. 3 men stood in a submarine 400 feet beneath the Caribbean Sea. They were exhausted, suffocating in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. They had lost contact with Moscow for days. Above them, American destroyers dropped depth charges that shook their steel coffin like the fists of an angry god. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed war had already begun. He had a nuclear torpedo. He had authorization to use it. 2 officers agreed. 1 did not. In our reality, that one dissenting voice saved the world. Vasily Arkhipov, whose name should be spoken with the same reverence as any prophet or saint, refused to fire. The submarine surfaced. Humanity continued. But what if he had said yes? What if on that suffocating afternoon, beneath the Sargasso Sea, 3 exhausted men had made a different choice? What if the nuclear torpedo had been launched, vaporizing the USS Randolph and its task force in a blast equivalent to the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima? This is not science fiction. This is not fantasy. This is a documented near miss, a moment when the thread of human civilization hung by a single word, a single vote, a single conscience. What follows is the story of what would have happened next. A chronicle of the world that almost was. A meditation on the terrifying fragility of everything we take for granted. Welcome to the timeline where Saturday, October 27th, 1962, became the day the world forgot how to dream.
Historical context: the road to October 1962. To understand how close we came to annihilation, you must first understand how we arrived at that moment beneath the Caribbean Sea. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not begin in October 1962. Its roots reached back through the entire Cold War, through the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, through the ideological chasm that split the world in 2 after 1945. By 1962, the United States and Soviet Union had been locked in a struggle for global supremacy for nearly 2 decades. Each side possessed weapons that could obliterate cities in seconds, rendering millions of years of human civilization into radioactive dust. Yet, paradoxically, these weapons had prevented war. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, meant that any nuclear conflict would result in the annihilation of both superpowers. No one could win, therefore no one could fight. But MAD only worked if both sides believed in the balance. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution transformed Cuba from an American playground into a communist state 90 miles from Florida. President Eisenhower authorized plans to overthrow Castro. When John F. Kennedy inherited these plans in 1961, he approved them, resulting in the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, a humiliation that made Kennedy look weak and Castro look invincible. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity. He had promised to defend Cuba from American aggression. More importantly, he needed to correct what he saw as a strategic imbalance. The United States had deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, pointed directly at Soviet cities. Khrushchev wanted leverage. In July 1962, Khrushchev and Castro agreed to secretly deploy Soviet nuclear missiles to Cuba, medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, capable of striking most of the eastern United States within minutes. Construction began in late summer. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Richard Heiser captured photographic evidence of Soviet missile installations under construction in Cuba. The images were processed and presented to President Kennedy the following day. Kennedy summoned his closest advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM. For 6 days, they debated in secret. Some advisors, including all the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued for immediate military action, airstrikes, to destroy the missiles, followed by a full invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy chose a more measured approach. On October 22nd, he appeared on national television to inform the American people about the missiles and announce a naval quarantine, a blockade, to prevent further Soviet military shipments to Cuba. He demanded that the Soviets dismantle the missiles already in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union. The world held its breath. Khrushchev responded by dispatching 4 Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines to protect Soviet ships heading to Cuba. Each submarine carried 22 conventional torpedoes and 1 special weapon, a nuclear-armed torpedo with a yield roughly equivalent to the Hiroshima bomb. The captains had authorization to use these weapons if they believed they were under attack and could not contact Moscow for orders. On submarine B-59, however, there was a complication. The flotilla's chief of staff, Captain 2nd Rank Vasily Arkhipov, was aboard as an extra officer. Due to his rank, all 3 senior officers, the captain, the political officer, and Arkhipov, had to agree unanimously to launch the nuclear torpedo. For hours, the world teetered on the brink of annihilation. Soviet ships approached the American blockade line. U-2 reconnaissance flights continued over Cuba. On October 27th, Black Saturday, tensions reached their peak. An American U-2 was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. Another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly triggering a Soviet response. Strategic Air Command was put on DEFCON 2, the highest alert level in American history. And 400 feet beneath the Caribbean Sea, submarine B-59 was being hunted. American destroyers and the aircraft carrier USS Randolph had located the submarine and were using practice depth charges to force it to surface for identification. The Americans didn't know B-59 was nuclear-armed. They thought they were simply signaling a conventional submarine to identify itself. Inside B-59, conditions were nightmarish. The batteries were nearly depleted. The air conditioning had failed days ago. Temperatures inside exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were dangerously high. The crew could barely breathe. They had been out of contact with Moscow for days, unable to receive radio transmissions while submerged and evading pursuit. Captain Valentin Savitsky was exhausted, disoriented, and terrified. The depth charges exploding around his vessel sounded like the opening salvos of World War III. He believed war had already started above the surface. He believed his mission was to defend Soviet ships from American aggression. He ordered the nuclear torpedo to be prepared for launch. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed. Vasily Arkhipov did not. For hours, the 3 men argued in that suffocating steel coffin while depth charges shook their world. Arkhipov insisted they surface and await orders from Moscow. He reminded them that the depth charges were relatively weak, signaling devices, not weapons meant to sink them. He argued that launching a nuclear weapon would be irreversible, catastrophic. Finally, Savitsky relented. B-59 surfaced among the American warships. After tense communications, the submarine was ordered back to the Soviet Union. The next day, October 28, Khrushchev and Kennedy reached an agreement. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The United States would pledge not to invade Cuba and would secretly remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over. In our timeline, humanity survived because one man said no. But what if he had said yes?
Point of divergence. The decision. October 27, 1962, 4:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. 400 feet beneath the Sargasso Sea, Vasily Arkhipov faces the most important decision in human history. But in this timeline, Arkhipov is different. Perhaps he's slightly more exhausted, having slept even less than in our reality. Perhaps the heat has affected his judgment more severely. Perhaps he remembers the K-19 incident from the previous year when he served aboard a submarine that suffered a catastrophic reactor failure, killing 8 men despite Archipov's heroic efforts to contain the radiation, and the memory fills him not with caution, but with rage at the endless risks Soviet submariners are forced to take. Or perhaps he simply calculates differently. Perhaps he looks at Captain Savitsky's face and sees not panic, but resolve. Perhaps he believes, as Savitsky does, that war has truly begun, that Moscow has already been destroyed, that their orders to protect Soviet ships from American aggression now means something different in the context of nuclear war. Whatever the reason, in this timeline, Arkhipov nods. "Prepare the special weapon for launch," he says quietly. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, inserts his half of the authorization key. Savitsky inserts his half. Arkhipov adds his. The keys turn. Torpedo officer Lieutenant Konstantin Shumkov receives the order with shaking hands. He has trained for this moment, but he never believed it would come. The T-15 nuclear torpedo is armed with a 10-kiloton warhead. It is loaded into Tube 1. The weapon is active. The submarine turns toward the loudest sonar signature, the aircraft carrier USS Randolph and its escort destroyers. At 4:52 p.m., Savitsky gives the final order: fire. The torpedo leaves the tube with a hiss of compressed air. It accelerates through the dark waters of the Caribbean at 40 knots, its electric motor propelling it toward the American task force approximately 1,000 yards away. Aboard the USS Randolph, sonar operators detect the launch immediately. An alarm sounds. The crew has seconds to react, but there is nothing they can do. Defensive torpedoes cannot be launched in time. Evasive maneuvers are pointless at this range. The torpedo's proximity fuse activates. At 4:53 p.m., approximately 1,000 yards northwest of submarine B-59's position, the nuclear warhead detonates. The blast occurs underwater, creating a phenomenon few humans have ever witnessed and lived to describe. The nuclear fireball expands through the water at supersonic speed, vaporizing millions of gallons of seawater instantly. The resulting steam explosion creates a massive bubble that rises toward the surface, carrying with it a column of superheated water and radioactive steam. The USS Randolph, a Forrestal-class aircraft carrier displacing 60,000 tons, is lifted bodily out of the water by the blast. The ship's keel fractures, its hull tears open. Within seconds, the carrier breaks into 3 massive sections. The 3,000 sailors aboard have no chance to escape. Most are killed instantly by the blast wave. The rest drown or are pulled under as the shattered sections of the carrier sink into the depths. The destroyers in the task force, USS Connie, USS Beale, USS Murray, suffer similar fates. Smaller vessels are simply obliterated by the blast. Within 3 minutes, every ship in the immediate area is either destroyed or sinking. Submarine B-59 is also caught in the blast. Although the crew knew it was coming, they underestimated the weapon's power at close range. The shock wave slams into the submarine like a giant fist. Internal bulkheads buckle, pipes burst. The submarine is thrown into an uncontrolled dive, spinning as it falls through the darkness. Captain Savitsky struggles to regain control, but it's too late. B-59 has been mortally wounded. Water is flooding into multiple compartments. The submarine is sinking. In the last moments before the icy water engulfs them, Vasily, Arkhipov, and Maslenikov exchange a look. They have just started World War III. They know they will not survive to see its conclusion. At 4:58 p.m., submarine B-59 implodes at a depth of 1,200 feet. All 78 crew members perish instantly. But their torpedo, has done its work. On the surface, a massive mushroom cloud rises over the Caribbean Sea, visible for miles. Radioactive steam and water fall back into the ocean, contaminating thousands of square miles. And in Washington, D.C., in Moscow, in military command centers around the world, red telephones begin to ring. The unthinkable has happened.
Escalation. The first hours. 5:04 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. The first reports come through military channels, not diplomatic ones. A massive underwater explosion in the Caribbean. Loss of all communication with Task Force Alpha. Eyewitness accounts from other vessels describe a mushroom cloud rising thousands of feet into the air. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara is in a meeting when an aide bursts in, his face white with terror. McNamara reads the initial report and feels his stomach drop. He immediately calls President Kennedy. The president is in the Oval Office, discussing the latest diplomatic overtures from Khrushchev with his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. When the phone rings, JFK's hand trembles slightly as he answers it. He listens for 30 seconds, his face draining of color. "Get everyone to the Situation Room now," he says quietly. By 5:15 p.m., XCOM has assembled in emergency session. The military representatives, General Curtis LeMay, Admiral George Anderson, the Joint Chiefs, are already advocating for immediate massive retaliation. LeMay is practically shouting, "The Soviets have attacked a U.S. aircraft carrier with a nuclear weapon. This is an act of war. They must respond with overwhelming force before the Soviets can launch a first strike from their homeland." But Kennedy is trying to think clearly through his shock and rage. Was this an accident, a rogue captain? He wants to communicate with Khrushchev to understand what happened before unleashing Armageddon. "Mr. President," LeMay says coldly, "if we wait, Moscow will launch everything they have. We have one chance, right now, to destroy their nuclear forces before they can strike our cities." McNamara interjects, "We don't know if Moscow even ordered this attack. It could have been a submarine captain acting independently." "Does it matter?" Admiral Anderson asks. 3,000 Americans are dead. A nuclear weapon has been used against us. If we don't respond with overwhelming force, we look weak. The Soviets will be emboldened. Kennedy wants to use the hotline to Moscow, but there is no hotline yet. It will be installed next year precisely because of this crisis. Instead, he orders an emergency message sent through diplomatic channels. The United States demands an immediate explanation for the nuclear attack and warns that further aggression will be met with full retaliation. But the message takes time to encode, transmit, decode, and deliver to Khrushchev, time that is running out. Meanwhile, military protocols are already in motion. Strategic Air Command has been at DEFCON 2 since earlier in the day. Now, at 5:27 p.m., General Thomas Power, SAC's commander, orders his forces to DEFCON 1, the highest state of readiness, meaning nuclear war is imminent or has already begun. B-52 bombers carrying nuclear weapons are launched from bases across the United States. They begin flying toward predetermined targets in the Soviet Union, awaiting the final order to cross into enemy airspace and release their payloads. Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles at bases throughout the American Midwest are brought to full alert, their crews standing by to launch on presidential order. In the Soviet Union, it is 1:04 a.m. on October 28th when word reaches Moscow of the nuclear detonation in the Caribbean. Khrushchev is awakened and brought immediately to an emergency session of the Politburo. The initial reports are confused. Soviet submarines were ordered to protect ships heading to Cuba, yes, but no one in Moscow authorized the use of nuclear weapons. This must be an American provocation, a false flag attack to justify American nuclear strikes on the Soviet Union. Marshal Rodin Malinovich, the Soviet defense minister, urges immediate preemptive action. American bombers are already in the air, heading towards Soviet territory. If they wait, the Soviet Union will be destroyed. They must launch their ICBMs now while they still can. But Khrushchev, like Kennedy, wants to understand what happened before starting a war that will kill hundreds of millions. He orders a message sent to Washington. The Soviet Union did not authorize any nuclear attack and demands clarification of American intentions. This message will also take time to arrive. time measured in minutes while military forces on both sides prepare for total war. At 5:41 p.m. Eastern Time, an American reconnaissance aircraft over Cuba detects unusual activity at Soviet missile sites. Mobile nuclear-armed cruise missiles have been moved to firing positions near Guantanamo Bay, pointed directly at the American naval base. American intelligence was completely unaware these weapons were in Cuba. This news reaches Kennedy at 5:49 p.m. The situation is spiraling out of control. Soviet nuclear weapons are being prepared for launch in Cuba. American forces are demanding authorization to strike. His military advisors are unanimous. They must attack Cuba immediately and launch a full nuclear strike on the Soviet Union before it's too late. Kennedy tries one more time to communicate with Moscow. At 6:02 p.m., he sends a personal message directly to Khrushchev through the Soviet embassy. Premier Khrushchev, American forces have been attacked with a nuclear weapon. I do not know if this was your order or a tragic accident. I do not want war, but I cannot hold back American military forces much longer unless I receive assurance from you that this attack was unauthorized and will not be repeated. Please respond immediately. In Moscow, Khrushchev receives Kennedy's message at 2:04 a.m. He drafts a response explaining that Soviet submarines were ordered to defend themselves if attacked, but did not have authorization to use nuclear weapons. He assures Kennedy that he also wants to avoid war and proposes an immediate ceasefire and investigation. But before Khrushchev's message can be transmitted, events in Cuba overtake diplomacy.
At 6:14 p.m. Eastern Time, American RF-8 Crusader reconnaissance aircraft are fired upon by Soviet anti-aircraft batteries in Cuba. One aircraft is hit and crashes. Simultaneously, Soviet field commanders in Cuba, believing that an American invasion is imminent following the nuclear detonation at sea, are given authority to use tactical nuclear weapons to defend themselves. This was always the nightmare scenario, that local commanders, out of contact with their capitals and believing war has begun, would make decisions that escalate the conflict beyond anyone's control. At 6:18 p.m., a Soviet FKR-1 cruise missile with a 14-kiloton nuclear warhead is launched from Cuba toward the U.S. naval station at Guantanamo Bay. The missile has a flight time of approximately 6 minutes. American radar detects the launch immediately. It is unambiguous. A nuclear-armed missile is heading toward American territory. Kennedy is immediately informed. There is no more time for diplomacy, no more time for restraint. His military commanders are unanimous. If they do not launch everything now, the Soviet Union will destroy the United States. At 6:21 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, President John F. Kennedy authorizes the execution of SIOP-62, the Single Integrated Operational Plan for Nuclear War. At 6:22 p.m., the nuclear missile strikes Guantanamo Bay. The entire naval base is obliterated. Approximately 5,000 American servicemen and their families are killed instantly. At 6:24 p.m., American Minuteman ICBMs begin launching from their silos in Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming. Within 10 minutes, 183 missiles are in the air, each carrying multiple nuclear warheads, arcing through space toward targets across the Soviet Union. At 6:25 p.m., SOC bombers receive the Go code. They cross into Soviet airspace, their bomb bay doors opening. In Moscow, Soviet early warning radar detects the American ICBM launches immediately. There is no more doubt. The nuclear war they always feared has begun. At 2:26 a.m. Moscow time, Premier Khrushchev gives the order he hoped he would never have to give. Soviet strategic rocket forces launched their entire operational arsenal, approximately 300 ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, all aimed at American cities, military bases, and strategic infrastructure. The missiles take approximately 30 minutes to reach their targets. For half an hour, both nations know what is coming, but can do nothing to stop it. Kennedy and his family are rushed to an underground bunker beneath the White House. Khrushchev retreats to a command center outside Moscow. Military commanders on both sides send final orders and wait for the end. And all across the Northern Hemisphere, people look up at the sky, seeing contrails, and knowing what they mean. The age of deterrence has failed. The age of extinction has begun.
The first strikes, October 27th to 28th. 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, October 27th, 1962. The first American nuclear weapons to hit Soviet territory are not missiles, but bombs, delivered by B-52 Stratofortress bombers that have been in the air for hours, waiting for the final authorization. They cross into Soviet airspace over the Kola Peninsula, where the Northern Fleet's submarine bases are concentrated. At 3:02 Moscow time, 4 thermonuclear bombs with yields ranging from 1 to 5 megatons detonate over military installations around Murmansk and Severomorsk. The mushroom clouds rise in the Arctic night, casting an eerie orange glow across the frozen landscape. 2 major naval bases are obliterated. Approximately 120,000 Soviet military personnel and civilians die in the first 3 minutes. This is just the beginning. At 7:14 p.m. Eastern Time, 3:14 a.m. Moscow time, the first wave of American ICBMs begins arriving over Soviet territory. The primary targets are Soviet ICBM fields, bomber bases, and command centers. The Strategic Air Command's war plan calls for a massive first strike to destroy as much of the Soviet nuclear arsenal as possible before it can be launched. But most Soviet missiles are already in the air. Over the next 10 minutes, 89 nuclear warheads detonate across Soviet territory. Cities with military installations, Chelyabinsk, Novosibirsk, Omsk, Sverdlovsk, are hit by multiple warheads. Each explosion is measured in megatons. Each fireball is hotter than the surface of the sun. Chelyabinsk, home to a major nuclear weapons production facility, is struck by 4 warheads, totaling 6 megatons. The city, with a population of 850,000, ceases to exist in less than a minute. The firestorm that follows burns for days. The Soviet retaliatory strike hits American targets at approximately the same time. At 7:16 p.m. Eastern Time, the first Soviet warheads begin arriving over the United States. New York City is struck by 3 warheads totaling 5 megatons. One detonates over Manhattan at an altitude of 8,000 feet, an airburst designed to maximize destruction through blast and thermal radiation. The fireball vaporizes everything within a 1-mile radius of ground zero. The blast wave, traveling at supersonic speed, levels every building within 3 miles. Fires ignite across all 5 boroughs. In less than 60 seconds, approximately 1.8 million people die. Most never know what happened. One moment they are going about their evening, finishing dinner, watching television, walking home from work. And the next moment, they simply cease to exist, converted to ash and shadow by the physics of nuclear fission. Washington, D.C. is hit by 2 warheads totaling 3 megatons. One detonates directly over the Capitol building. The other strikes the Pentagon. Both structures are completely destroyed. Despite the evacuation of top leadership to bunkers, thousands of government workers and military personnel die instantly. Chicago, Los Angeles, Detroit, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Boston, all are struck by multiple warheads. The great American cities, centers of culture and commerce and human achievement, are transformed into radioactive wastelands in minutes. In the Soviet Union, Moscow is struck by 5 American warheads totaling 10 megatons. The Kremlin is obliterated. Red Square becomes a crater. The Bolshoi Theater, St. Basil Cathedral, the monuments to Soviet achievement, all are erased. 6 million Muscovites die in the first 10 minutes. Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, Stalingrad, each suffers the same fate. The Soviet Union's great cities, rebuilt after the devastation of World War II at tremendous cost in blood and treasure, are once again reduced to rubble. But this time, there will be no rebuilding. The attacks continue through the night. Second and third waves of bombers arrive. Submarines launch their missiles from positions off both coasts. Military bases, industrial centers, transportation hubs, anything of strategic value is targeted and destroyed. By midnight Eastern Time, October 27th, approximately 2,800 nuclear warheads have detonated across the Northern Hemisphere. The combined yield exceeds 5,000 megatons, equivalent to 340,000 Hiroshima bombs. In the United States, every major city has been hit. Approximately 85 million Americans are dead or dying. The casualties include President Kennedy and most of XCOM, killed when a Soviet warhead penetrated the White House bunker's defenses. The line of succession is chaos. No one knows who is in charge. In the Soviet Union, casualties are even higher. Approximately 110 million Soviets are dead. Premier Khrushchev survives in his bunker, but he has no communications with his military forces. The Soviet Union, as a functioning state, no longer exists. But the horror is not confined to the combatant nations.
Britain and France, as NATO allies, are also targeted by Soviet missiles. London is struck by 2 warheads, Paris by 3. Approximately 8 million Western Europeans die in the exchange. NATO bases in West Germany, Italy, and Turkey are destroyed. China, though not a participant in the conflict, is struck by American warheads targeting military installations that U.S. intelligence believes could support Soviet forces. Beijing, Shanghai, and several other major cities are hit. Approximately 30 million Chinese die, making China a victim of a war it did not start. And then there are the accidents and errors. In the chaos of nuclear war, several weapons malfunction or hit unintended targets. A Soviet missile aimed at a military base in Alaska goes off course and detonates over Anchorage, killing 40,000 civilians. An American bomber, damaged by Soviet air defenses, crashes with its nuclear payload still aboard, spreading radioactive material across hundreds of square miles. By dawn on October 28th, the active phase of the nuclear war is over. There are no more targets worth striking. Both sides have expended their arsenals. Command and control systems have broken down. The superpowers, for all practical purposes, no longer exist as organized societies. But the dying has barely begun. Across the Northern Hemisphere, hundreds of cities are burning. The firestorms create massive updrafts that carry millions of tons of smoke and ash into the atmosphere. The smoke rises into the stratosphere where there is no rain to wash it out. In the coming days, this smoke will begin to circle the globe, blocking sunlight and beginning a process that scientists in a future that will never exist would call nuclear winter. For now, in the immediate aftermath, survivors emerge from shelters to find a world transformed beyond recognition. Cities are gone. Governments are gone. The sky glows red with distant fires. The air tastes of ash and death. And everywhere, the injured are screaming. Medical facilities that survived the initial strikes are immediately overwhelmed. Hundreds of thousands of people suffer from severe burns, radiation sickness, and trauma injuries. But there are no doctors to treat them, no hospitals still standing, no medicines available. In New York City, those who survived the initial blast by being in subway tunnels or reinforced buildings emerged to find Manhattan transformed into hell. Fires rage through the ruins. Radioactive fallout is beginning to settle like deadly snow. Those exposed to high doses of radiation will be dead within days. Those exposed to moderate doses will suffer for weeks before dying. The lucky ones, those exposed to low doses, will develop cancers years later, in a future where no medical treatment will be available. The same scene plays out in every attacked city: Moscow, Washington, Chicago, Leningrad, Los Angeles. Millions of survivors wandering through radioactive ruins, looking for water, food, shelter, and finding only death. By October 28th, approximately 220 million people are dead. But this is just the immediate toll. The secondary effects, radiation, disease, starvation, societal collapse, will kill far more in the weeks and months to come. And hovering over all of this, invisible but inexorable, is the smoke. Black, toxic clouds rising from hundreds of burning cities, beginning their journey into the stratosphere, where they will encircle the planet and blot out the sun. The nuclear exchange lasted less than 6 hours. Its consequences will last for generations, if there are any generations left. The immediate aftermath, October 28th, November 15th, 1962. The silence is perhaps the most disturbing thing. For decades, cities had been defined by their sounds: traffic, voices, music, the mechanical hum of modern civilization. Now, in the ruins of New York, Moscow, London, all the great urban centers of the Northern Hemisphere, there is only the crackle of fires and the wind blowing through skeletal buildings. October 28th dawns cold and dark across the northern United States. Survivors who spent the night in shelters emerge to find the sky obscured by a reddish-gray haze. The sun is barely visible, a dim orange disk struggling through the smoke. The temperature has dropped 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, not because of the season, but because millions of tons of smoke and ash are already beginning to block sunlight. In Washington, D.C., or what remains of it, the federal government has ceased to function. President Kennedy is dead, killed when Soviet warheads struck the White House bunker complex. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was in Texas when the war began. His fate is unknown. The Speaker of the House, the President pro tempore of the Senate, the entire line of succession, all are dead or missing. Regional military commanders have taken control in areas where military bases survived. But communications between these pockets of authority are sporadic or non-existent. The United States, as a unified nation, has effectively ceased to exist. The same is true in the Soviet Union. Premier Khrushchev survived in a bunker outside Moscow, but he has no way to communicate with the rest of the country. The Communist Party structure, the government ministries, the military command, all have been decapitated. Regional Soviet officials and military officers are making decisions independently, with no coordination and often conflicting objectives. The immediate concern for survivors is basic survival: water, food, shelter, and avoiding the deadly radioactive fallout that is settling over vast areas. Fallout patterns are determined by wind currents and the locations of nuclear detonations. Cities hit by air bursts, where warheads detonated thousands of feet above ground, generate relatively less fallout than ground bursts, which sucked up tons of irradiated soil and distributed it across hundreds of miles. The American Midwest, where many ICM silos were targeted with ground bursts, is blanketed with lethal fallout. Anyone exposed to this environment for more than a few hours will die of radiation sickness within days. In New York City, approximately 200,000 people survived the initial strikes by being in subway tunnels, deep basements, or simply being far enough from ground zero. But survival in the immediate term does not mean long-term survival. The city's infrastructure is destroyed. Water mains are shattered, the power grid is gone. Hospitals are rubble. Grocery stores, warehouses, supply depots, all have been destroyed or inaccessible. Water becomes the first crisis. Survivors break into stores looking for bottled water, but supplies run out within hours. Some drink from the Hudson River, not knowing that it is heavily contaminated with radioactive fallout and industrial chemicals from destroyed factories upstream. They will die of dysentery and radiation sickness within a week. Food is the second crisis. Canned goods can be found in the ruins, but there is not nearly enough for 200,000 people. Violence erupts over resources. Armed gangs form within days, controlling access to food and water. The strong prey on the weak. Society, that thin veneer of civilization built over millennia, disintegrates in less than a week. Radiation sickness begins to manifest among those exposed to high doses during the attacks or from fallout. The symptoms are horrific: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, bleeding from the gums and rectum, hair loss, skin lesions. With no medical care available, victims die in agony over days or weeks. Their bodies are left in the streets. There is no organized effort to bury the dead, and no one has the strength or resources to do so. By November 1st, 4 days after the exchange, additional casualties from radiation, injury, disease, and violence have pushed the total death toll in the United States to approximately 95 million, nearly half of the population. In the Soviet Union, the toll has reached 125 million. But the dying is accelerating. The smoke from hundreds of burning cities has created an atmospheric phenomenon that scientists would later call nuclear winter, if there were any scientists left to study it. The stratosphere is filled with an estimated 150 million tons of black carbon smoke particles. These particles are absorbing sunlight at high altitude while blocking it from reaching the ground. By November 5th, average temperatures across the northern hemisphere have dropped by 25 degrees Fahrenheit from pre-war norms. In regions that were experiencing autumn weather, it is now effectively winter. In regions that were already experiencing winter, temperatures have plummeted to levels not seen in centuries. Agricultural regions that survived the nuclear strikes are facing catastrophic crop failures. The reduced sunlight, estimates suggest only 5 to 10% of normal sunlight is reaching the surface, means that photosynthesis has essentially stopped. Crops that were still in fields during late October have frozen and died. Winter wheat, which should have been planted in November, cannot grow in darkness and cold. The global food supply chain has collapsed. Even regions that were not directly attacked, South America, Africa, Australia, are experiencing rapid disruptions. Ships are not sailing because ports are destroyed or closed. International communications are severely disrupted. Countries that depended on food imports are facing immediate starvation. In the United States, rural areas that escaped direct nuclear attack are facing their own crises. Refugees from destroyed cities are fleeing into the countryside seeking food and shelter, but rural communities have limited resources and are overwhelmed. Armed confrontations break out between locals and refugees. Martial law is declared by regional military commanders, but there are not enough troops to enforce it. In Iowa, farmers who survived the strikes on nearby ICBM silos and who still have crops in storage become targets. Bands of armed men from Des Moines, which was partially destroyed by a nuclear strike, attack farms to seize food. Some farmers fight back, others flee, abandoning their homes and supplies. By mid-November, much of Iowa's agricultural heartland is in chaos, with food being hoarded, stolen, or destroyed in conflicts. The same pattern repeats across the rural United States, in Soviet agricultural regions, in the Canadian prairies, in the farmlands of Ukraine and Kazakhstan. The food that could have sustained survivors through the winter is being consumed immediately, fought over, or wasted. In Western Europe, countries that were not directly attacked are nonetheless facing catastrophic conditions. Fallout from Soviet strikes on British and French cities has spread across the continent. The smoke from burning cities in the USSR, Eastern Europe, and China has reached European skies, blocking sunlight and dropping temperatures. Britain, having lost London and several other cities to Soviet strikes, is struggling with governmental collapse and refugee crises. Approximately 12 million Britons have died from direct attacks, radiation, and the immediate aftermath. The remaining population is descending into chaos. The royal family was evacuated to secure locations, but the government's ability to exercise authority is minimal. In France, Italy, West Germany, all are experiencing similar collapses. NATO as an organization no longer exists. Its headquarters was destroyed, and member nations are focused entirely on domestic survival. In the South Hemisphere, nations that were not directly involved in the nuclear exchange are watching in horror as reports filter in about the devastation in the north. But they are not safe. The atmospheric smoke is beginning to spread southward. The darkening skies reach Argentina by November 10th, Australia by November 12th. Scientists in Australia, using instruments that survive the electromagnetic pulses from distant nuclear explosions, are measuring the extent of the catastrophe. They calculate that global temperatures are dropping at an unprecedented rate. They project that within weeks, the entire planet will experience temperatures below freezing, even in tropical regions. They send urgent messages to surviving governments, warning that the nuclear winter will likely cause crop failures worldwide and could lead to the extinction of most large animal species, possibly including humans. But there is no one left to coordinate a global response. The United Nations building in New York is a radioactive crater. International communications are fragmentary. Each surviving nation is focused solely on its own immediate survival. In China, the unintended victim of the war, the death toll from American nuclear strikes has reached 35 million. The communist government survives, but barely. Premier Zhou Enlai, operating from an emergency command center, is trying to maintain order, but the country is fragmenting. Regional commanders are seizing power. Food shortages are already severe, and the nuclear winter has not yet fully manifested. Japan, which suffered no direct nuclear strikes, is nonetheless facing catastrophic conditions. The country depends heavily on food imports, which have ceased entirely. Fallout from strikes on China and Soviet territory has contaminated fishing grounds. The darkened skies are killing crops. Japan's population of 95 million faces mass starvation within months. India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, the Middle East all face similar fates. Even regions far from the nuclear exchange are being dragged into the abyss by the global environmental catastrophe. By November 15th, 3 weeks after the war began, the global death toll has reached approximately 350 million. But this is still only the beginning. The vast majority of deaths will come not from the nuclear weapons themselves, but from the secondary effects: starvation, disease, cold, and societal collapse. In the ruins of civilization, survivors huddled in darkness beneath skies that no longer offer light or warmth. They burn whatever they can find for heat: furniture, books, even the bodies of the dead. They fight over scraps of food. They watch their children grow weaker each day and know there is nothing they can do. And they wonder if perhaps the people who died instantly in the nuclear fireballs were the lucky ones.
The first winter, November 1962 to March 1963. By December 1st, 1962, the Northern Hemisphere is experiencing temperatures 40 degrees Fahrenheit below seasonal norms. In New York City, where autumn temperatures should be in the 40s, it is 5 degrees Fahrenheit. In Moscow, it is -30. In Chicago, it is -10. And the sun has almost disappeared. At noon, the sky offers only a dim reddish twilight, enough to see by, but barely. Photosynthesis has effectively ceased across the entire planet. The smoke in the stratosphere shows no signs of dissipating. It will remain for years, perhaps decades. The survivors of the nuclear strikes now face an enemy even more implacable than radiation: cold. In the ruins of American cities, those who survived the bombs and the initial chaos now face freezing temperatures without heating, electricity, or adequate shelter. Buildings that remain standing after the nuclear strikes offer some protection from the cold, but without heating systems, they're only marginally better than being outside. Survivors burn anything combustible: furniture, books, wooden doors and floorboards torn from buildings, even paper money, which has no value anymore. They wrap themselves in layers of clothing scavenged from department stores and homes. They huddle together for warmth, but the cold is relentless. In Washington, D.C., a group of approximately 500 survivors has established a community in the metro tunnels beneath the ruined city. The tunnels offer some protection from the cold and from the radioactive surface, but conditions are desperate. They have no reliable source of food or clean water. Disease is spreading. The tunnels reek of human waste and death. A man who was once a congressman, his name no longer matters, has become the de facto leader of this underground community. He organizes scavenging parties that venture to the surface during the dim daylight hours, searching for food and supplies. Many never return, killed by radiation, cold, or other survivor groups competing for the same resources. By mid-December, half of the tunnel community is dead from disease, starvation, or cold. The survivors have begun to face an unthinkable choice: cannibalism. Some refuse, choosing to starve instead. Others justify it as necessary for survival. The moral framework of civilization has completely collapsed. This same horror is playing out in survivor communities across the northern United States, in the Soviet Union, in Europe, in China, anywhere humans managed to survive the initial nuclear strikes. In rural areas, conditions are somewhat better, but only marginally. Farmers who stockpiled food might have enough to last through the winter, but they face constant attacks from refugees and armed bands. Many farmers had become essentially feudal lords, protecting their food supplies with armed force and trading food for labor or other resources. In Montana, a farming community of approximately 200 people has survived under the leadership of a former sheriff. They have enough stored grain and preserved food to last through the winter if they ration carefully. They have weapons to defend against raiders. They have organized shelter in barns and reinforced buildings. But they are slowly starving. The rations are not enough to sustain hard physical labor in extreme cold. People are losing weight,
Children are dying of malnutrition and cold despite their parents' best efforts. The community's population drops from 200 to 150 by January to 100 by February. And they know that even if they survive the winter, there will be no spring planting. The skies remain dark, the ground is frozen solid. Even if the smoke eventually clears, the soil has been poisoned by radioactive fallout. Agriculture, as they knew it, has ended.
In the Soviet Union, the collapse is even more severe. The USSR was more centralized than the United States, more dependent on government coordination for food distribution. With the government destroyed, regional collapse has been swift and total. Siberia, ironically, fares relatively better than European Russia. The region was lightly populated, and many communities were already somewhat self-sufficient due to distance from central authority. The extreme cold that is devastating the rest of the world is not much worse than a typical Siberian winter. But Siberia's population is small, and there is no hope of rebuilding civilization from there. In European Russia, the major cities that were struck, Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, are dead zones. The few survivors have fled into the countryside, but there is no food. The collective farms that fed the Soviet Union have collapsed. The transportation networks are destroyed. Rural populations, already struggling, cannot support millions of urban refugees. Starvation becomes universal by January. In the Soviet Union, in the United States, in China, in Europe, everywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, food supplies are exhausted. People are eating things that were never meant as food: tree bark, leather, grass, even dirt. But these provide no nutrition. The human body begins to consume itself, metabolizing muscle tissue to keep vital organs functioning, until finally, there is nothing left to burn. The disease outbreaks in January and February are catastrophic. Typhus, dysentery, cholera, tuberculosis, diseases that modern medicine had controlled or eliminated, roar back with apocalyptic fury. In cramped, unsanitary conditions, with no medical care and populations weakened by malnutrition, infection spreads like wildfire. In the metro tunnels beneath Washington, the entire surviving population of 250 people is dead from typhus by February 1st. In the Montana farming community, an outbreak of dysentery kills 40 of the remaining 100 survivors in a single week. Across the Northern Hemisphere, the death toll from starvation and disease in this first winter exceeds the casualties from the nuclear strikes themselves. By March 1, 1963, an estimated 800 million people have died, nearly 1/4 of the pre-war global population. But the dying is not confined to the Northern Hemisphere. In the Southern Hemisphere, nations that escaped direct nuclear attack are experiencing their own catastrophes. The nuclear winter has spread globally. Even in equatorial regions, temperatures have dropped below freezing. Tropical crops, bananas, cassava, rice, have died in the fields. Livestock are dying from cold and lack of feed. Brazil, which had a population of 75 million and was food self-sufficient before the war, is experiencing mass starvation by January. The Brazilian government has collapsed. Cities have descended into chaos. Rural areas are marginally better off, but not by much. The global climate catastrophe has made agriculture nearly impossible, even in regions that normally have year-round growing seasons. Australia, isolated and relatively undamaged by fallout, had hoped to weather the crisis. But by December, the nuclear winter has reached Australian skies. Temperatures that should be in the 80s Fahrenheit, it's summer in the Southern Hemisphere, are hovering around freezing. Crops are failing. Livestock are dying. The Australian government, still functioning, attempts to coordinate a national survival effort. Rationing is imposed. The military is mobilized to maintain order and distribute remaining food supplies. But the mathematics are inexorable. They do not have enough food to feed their population through an extended agricultural collapse. By February, Australia is experiencing its own starvation crisis. Riots break out in Sydney and Melbourne. The government responds with martial law, but the military forces themselves are starving. The social order is fraying. In Africa, the catastrophe takes different forms depending on the region. North Africa, closer to the nuclear exchange and more heavily affected by fallout,
experiences rapid collapse. Egypt, dependent on Nile River agriculture and food imports, suffers mass death from starvation by January. Sub-Saharan Africa, more remote from the nuclear strikes, fares somewhat better initially, but faces the same agricultural collapse from the nuclear winter. Traditional subsistence agriculture, which had sustained African populations for millennia, cannot function without sunlight. Crops fail. Wild game, already declining due to habitat loss, dies off rapidly. By March 1963, famines are spreading across the continent. Indigenous peoples in remote regions, the Amazon, the highlands of New Guinea, parts of Central Africa, initially believe they might be spared. But the nuclear winter reaches everywhere. Even in the densest jungles, temperatures drop and light dims. The ecosystems that supported these populations begin to collapse. Animals die. Plants fail to fruit. Starvation comes even to those who had no connection to the industrial civilization that destroyed itself. By March 1963, the global death toll has reached 1 billion, one-third of humanity. But the crisis is far from over. The nuclear winter shows no signs of abating. The smoke in the stratosphere is stable. Atmospheric models, if there were any scientists left to run them, would predict that it will remain for a decade or more, perhaps longer. Global temperatures have stabilized at approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit below pre-war norms, but there is no indication they will rise anytime soon. And this means there will be no spring. In the Northern Hemisphere, the ground remains frozen solid in March, when farmers in the pre-war world would have been preparing to plant. Even if survivors wanted to plant crops, the ground cannot be worked. The seeds would not germinate. The darkness would prevent growth. The same is true in the Southern Hemisphere. March is autumn there, a time for harvesting before winter. But there is no harvest. There was no summer growing season. The crops that were in the fields in October 1962 died when the nuclear winter began. Nothing has grown since. The inescapable conclusion is becoming clear to survivors with the knowledge to understand it. Agriculture has ended. The human population, which had grown to 3 billion by exploiting agricultural food production, can no longer be sustained. The Earth's carrying capacity for humans has dropped to a tiny fraction of what it was. Perhaps a few million people, in scattered locations with unique circumstances, might survive by hunting, fishing, and foraging, but billions cannot. March 1963 marks the moment when the last organized governments in the Southern Hemisphere collapse. Australia, Argentina, South Africa, the nations that had clung to some semblance of order, finally succumb to the inevitable. When the food runs out and there is no prospect of growing more, social order becomes impossible to maintain. The Australian government issues a final broadcast on March 15, 1963. The Prime Minister, speaking from Canberra, acknowledges that the government can no longer function. He releases the military and police from their duties to care for their own families. He advises citizens to make peace with whatever gods you believe in. The broadcast ends. The transmitter shuts down. Australia descends into the same darkness, literal and metaphorical, that has consumed the rest of the world. By March 31, 1963, 6 months after the nuclear war began, the global human population has declined to approximately 1.5 billion. Half of humanity is dead, and the die-off is accelerating.
The long dying, April 1963 to December 1965. The second year after the war is in many ways worse than the first. In the first year, there was still hope, irrational, desperate hope, but hope nonetheless. Survivors believed that the smoke would clear, that spring would come, that somehow humanity would recover. There was still food to scavenge, still supplies left over from civilization. There were still enough people alive that communities could form, could try to rebuild. By April 1963, all such illusions have been shattered. The smoke is not cleared, spring has not come. The few organized survival communities that made it through the first winter watch helplessly
as their remaining food supplies dwindle to nothing. There is no prospect of resupply. There will be no harvest this year or next year or any year in the foreseeable future. The Great Die-Off enters its second phase, the systematic elimination of every large animal population on Earth. In the pre-war world, the Earth's terrestrial ecosystems supported billions of large mammals, humans, livestock, and wild animals. These populations depended, directly or indirectly, on photosynthesis. Plants captured solar energy and converted it to food. Herbivores ate plants, carnivores ate herbivores. The entire food chain was powered by sunlight. With sunlight reduced to 5 to 10% of normal levels, photosynthesis has essentially ceased. The few plants that survive are deep-rooted species drawing on stored energy reserves, or opportunistic species clinging to life at the margins. But there is not enough plant growth to support large herbivore populations. Cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, all the livestock that humans domesticated over millennia die of starvation. In regions where survivors managed to keep livestock alive through the first winter by feeding them stored hay and grain, the animals are slaughtered for food as feed supplies run out. But this only delays the inevitable. Once the livestock are gone, they're gone. There are no breeding populations left to rebuild from. Wild herbivores, deer, elk, moose, bison, antelope, apex predators that survived millions of years of climate change and competition, are eliminated within a year of the nuclear war. With no prey animals left, they starve or turn on each other. The last wild wolf in North America likely dies sometime in late 1963, though of course there is no one to record the moment. Humans, being omnivores and tool users, survive slightly longer than specialized herbivores or carnivores, but only slightly. By summer 1963, the global human population has dropped to approximately 1 billion. These survivors are concentrated in a few categories. First, isolated communities with access to preserved food and the weapons to defend it. These are typically rural, well-armed groups in regions that escaped direct nuclear strikes and heavy fallout. They are surviving by consuming pre-war food stores, canned goods, dried foods, frozen meat from livestock slaughtered early in the crisis. But these stores are finite. A community of 100 people consuming 2,000 calories per day per person requires 73 million calories a year. Even large stockpiles cannot sustain populations indefinitely. By late 1963, even the best supplied communities are facing the exhaustion of their food reserves. Second, coastal communities with access to fishing, ocean ecosystems being partially insulated from the surface temperature drops and less dependent on direct sunlight, phytoplankton can survive with less light than land plants, have survived better than terrestrial ecosystems. Fish populations, while declining, still exist. Survivor communities in Norway, coastal Canada, Alaska, Chile, New Zealand, places with fishing traditions and access to boats and equipment are surviving by eating fish. But fish populations are declining rapidly. The collapse of phytoplankton due to reduced sunlight is working its way up the marine food chain. By 1964, even ocean fisheries are beginning to fail. Third, and most grimly, there are survivors who have turned to cannibalism. In the ruins of major cities and in desperate survivor communities, the taboo against eating human flesh has broken down completely. The recently dead, whether from starvation, disease, or violence, become food for the living. Some groups justify this as honoring the dead by allowing their bodies to sustain survivors. Others simply do it without justification, driven by the overpowering imperative to survive. Cannibalism is not a viable long-term survival strategy. It simply delays starvation by consuming the population itself. But it explains how some urban populations survive into 1964 when no other food sources exist. By December 1963, 1 year after the first winter, the global population has dropped to approximately 500 million. 3/4 of humanity has died. The survivors are scattered, isolated, and facing conditions that offer no hope of recovery. The year 1964 brings no improvement. The nuclear winter persists. The smoke in the stratosphere shows no sign of dissipating. Global temperatures remain 40 degrees below pre-war norms. The sun remains a dim reddish disk barely visible through the haze. In the northern hemisphere, there is no summer. Temperatures in July 1964, which should be in the 80s Fahrenheit across most of North America, struggle to reach freezing. The Great Lakes are frozen solid. Snow remains on the ground year-round across most of Canada, the northern United States, Russia, and northern Europe. Photosynthesis remains impossible. No crops grow. Forests, deprived of sunlight, are dying. Trees that survive the first winter die in the second, their stored energy reserves exhausted. Entire forests across North America, Europe, and Asia are becoming graveyards of standing dead timber. The few survivor communities that made it through 1963 face a terrible calculus in 1964. Their food supplies are exhausted. There is no possibility of resupply. Their options are either to disperse, sending people away to die individually in the hope that a smaller group might survive on whatever remains, or to die together. Most communities choose to die together. It is a more humane end than abandoning the elderly, the children, the weak to die alone in the frozen darkness. In the Montana farming community that survived through 1963 with 40 members, the end comes in March 1964. The former sheriff who led them through the crisis gathers everyone together and explains that the food is gone. They have perhaps a week left. He proposes that they end it on their own terms rather than starving over several weeks. Most agree. Some couples and families choose to die privately in their own way. Others gather in the community meeting hall. They share the last of a bottle of whiskey that was saved for this moment, tell stories about the world that was, and then take poison made from stored agricultural chemicals. The Montana community dies peacefully, which is more than most survivors will experience. Their bodies will never be found. In the frozen conditions, they will remain preserved for decades, a silent monument to a community that tried to survive and failed. This scene repeats thousands of times across the world in 1964. Survivor communities reaching the end of their resources choose death with dignity over death by starvation. By December 1964, 2 years after the nuclear war, the global human population has dropped to approximately 100 million. 97% of humanity is dead. The survivors at this point are almost entirely coastal fishing communities in regions with relatively intact marine ecosystems. Norway, Alaska, Chile, New Zealand, isolated Pacific islands, these are the final refuges of humanity. But even these communities are struggling. Fish populations continue to decline. The ocean ecosystems are collapsing more slowly than terrestrial ecosystems, but they are collapsing. Phytoplankton, the base of the marine food chain, cannot survive with only 5% of normal sunlight. The die-off is working its way up from the smallest organisms to the largest. In Norway, a fishing village of 200 people has survived through 1964 by eating fish, seals, and seabirds. They are one of the largest surviving human communities left on Earth. But by late 1964, their catches are declining. The fish populations in their fishing grounds are noticeably smaller. The seals are becoming rare. Even the seabirds, which ranged widely and should have been somewhat insulated from local ecosystem collapse, are disappearing. The village elder, a woman who was a fishmonger before the war, understands what this means. The oceans are dying. When the oceans die completely, humanity will follow. She gathers the village and proposes a desperate plan. Take their boats and sail west towards Iceland and Greenland, hoping to find fishing grounds that are less depleted. It is a gamble. They might find nothing, might die at sea, but staying guarantees death. Half the village agrees to go. They load their boats with preserved fish, water, and equipment and set sail in May 1965. The other half chooses to stay, believing that the local ecosystem will recover or that sailing into unknown waters is too risky. We will never know what happened to the boats. They sailed west into the North Atlantic under dark skies and never returned. Perhaps they found new fishing grounds and survived for a time. Perhaps they were caught in storms and sank. Perhaps they reached Iceland and found it as desolate as everywhere else. The half of the village that stayed dies of starvation by October 1965. The fish never come back. By December 1965, 3 years after the nuclear war, the global human population has dropped below 10 million. The survivors are scattered across remote coasts and islands, clustered in groups rarely larger than a few hundred people, surviving on declining fish populations and whatever else they can scavenge from the sea. There are no governments, no nations, no cities, no agriculture, no industry, no medicine, no books being written, no history being recorded. The accumulated knowledge and achievement of 10,000 years of human civilization has been reduced to small groups of people huddled around fires, eating raw fish and waiting to die. And the nuclear winter persists. The smoke in the stratosphere remains. The sun remains hidden. The cold remains. The darkness remains. The earth has become a frozen tomb, and humanity is dying in it.
The final populations, 1966 to 1970. By 1966, human extinction appears inevitable. The remaining populations, scattered fishing communities totaling perhaps 5 million people, are clearly doomed. Marine ecosystems continue to collapse. Catches decline every year. Starvation is universal. But against all probability, a few populations manage to persist. The key factor is location. Certain coastal regions, particularly in the Pacific, have unique characteristics that allow marginal survival. Deep ocean upwelling brings nutrients from the abyssal depths, supporting phytoplankton communities that can survive with minimal light. Coral reefs, though severely damaged, provide some structural habitat for fish populations. Cold water species, from the Arctic and Antarctic, migrate to mid-latitudes as those regions become cold enough to support them. In the Northwest Pacific, a community on Haida Gwaii, formerly the Queen Charlotte Islands, off the coast of British Columbia, has survived to 1966. Originally a group of about 300 people who fled there from Vancouver in the weeks after the war, the population has declined to 150 by early 1966. They survive by fishing, gathering shellfish, hunting seals, and eating seaweed. The surrounding waters, fed by the nutrient-rich Alaskan Current, maintain a minimal but functional ecosystem. The fish are smaller and less numerous than before the war, but they exist. The community has adapted to the new reality. They live in crude shelters built from driftwood and salvaged materials. They wear clothing from sealskins and woven plant fibers. They have no electricity, no fuel for heating beyond wood fires, no medical supplies beyond basic herbalism. They have effectively reverted to a pre-industrial existence, but they are alive. The population is not stable, deaths exceed births, but the decline is slow enough that the community persists through 1966, 1967, and beyond. Children are born, though few survive infancy. The weak and elderly die from disease, cold, or malnutrition. The population slowly decreases, but it does not collapse entirely. Similar communities persist in other locations: isolated islands in the Pacific, remote fjords in Norway and Chile, coastal Alaska and Siberia. The total global human population in 1966 is perhaps 3 million. 99.9% of pre-war humanity is dead. But these final populations are resilient. They are resilient because they have something the urban populations did not have: a direct connection to food sources that did not depend on agriculture or industrial infrastructure. They are resilient because they are small enough that the degraded ecosystems can support them, at least marginally. And they are resilient because they have already paid the price in death that adaptation requires. The weak, the sick, the unadaptable all died in 1963 and 1964. The survivors are self-selected for physical toughness and psychological resilience. By 1968, the nuclear winter is finally beginning to moderate. The smoke in the stratosphere, after 6 years, is slowly precipitating out. Sunlight levels are increasing, not to pre-war levels, but to perhaps 20 to 30% of normal, compared to the 5 to 10% that prevailed from 1963 to 1967. This is enough for some plants to begin photosynthesizing again. In the Pacific Northwest, survivors notice that seaweed growth is increasing. Kelp forests, which had been nearly destroyed, begin to recover. With the kelp comes a slow recovery of fish populations that depend on kelp forests for habitat. It is not a return to pre-war conditions. The oceans have been fundamentally altered. Many species are extinct. Ecosystem complexity has been drastically reduced. But it is enough for small human populations to survive. By 1970, 8 years after the war, the global human population has stabilized at approximately 2 million. This is roughly the global human population in 10,000 BCE, before the development of agriculture.
And indeed, the surviving humans have essentially returned to a pre-agricultural existence. They are hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, surviving on fish, shellfish, seals, seabirds, and whatever plant materials they can gather from the recovering coastal ecosystems. They have no writing. Literacy is useless when there are no books to read and no reason to write. They have no metals. Metallurgy requires fuel and temperatures that cannot be achieved with scavenged wood. They have only the most basic tools, made from stone, bone, wood, and shell. The knowledge of the pre-war world has been almost entirely lost. There are still a few elders who remember electricity, airplanes, cities, the internet. They tell stories to the children about the world that was, but these stories sound like myths, like fairy tales about a magical time when humans were gods. The children listen, but do not really believe. Their world is a world of cold, darkness, hunger, and struggle. The idea of cities with millions of people, of machines that could fly through the air, of food in abundance, these things are too fantastic to be real. Surely the elders are making them up, or perhaps they were dreams or visions, not actual history. Within a generation, the old world will be completely forgotten. The few survivors who remember will die, and with them will die the last living memories of human civilization. In the Haida Gwaii community, now numbering about 100 people, an old man named Douglas sits by a fire in 1970, telling stories to his grandchildren. He was a software engineer in Vancouver before the war. He worked on cloud computing infrastructure. He drove a Volvo. He watched Netflix. He worried about his 401k. Now he sits in sealskin clothing in a driftwood shelter, eating raw fish, and tries to explain to children who have never seen a light bulb what an iPhone was. They don't understand. They smile politely and listen to Grandpa's strange stories, but they don't believe them. They believe in the sea, the fish, the seals, the cold, the darkness. These are the realities of their world. The rest is just old man stories, meaningless words about a world that never was. Douglas knows this. He knows that when he dies, probably within a few years, the last person who truly understands what was lost will be gone. The human race will continue, probably, in these scattered fishing communities, but human civilization is already dead. Sometimes on clear nights, he looks up at the sky. The stars are visible again now that the smoke is clearing. They are the same stars he remembers from before the war, the same patterns, the same constellations. But they mean something different now. Before, the stars were abstractions, distant suns around which might orbit distant planets. Humanity was expanding its knowledge, building space telescopes, planning missions to Mars. The stars represented humanity's future, the infinite possibilities of cosmic exploration. Now the stars are just lights in the sky. They have no meaning beyond their immediate appearance. They are not humanity's destiny. They are just another feature of a world that humans barely survive in, like the fish in the sea or the seals on the rocks. Douglas weeps sometimes, though he hides it from his grandchildren. He weeps for the loss, for the sheer magnitude of what was destroyed. Not just the lives, 3 billion people, each with their own dreams.
Douglas weeps sometimes, though he hides it from his grandchildren. He weeps for the loss, for the sheer magnitude of what was destroyed. Not just the lives, 3 billion people, each with their own dreams and loves and hopes, but the accumulated knowledge, the art, the music, the literature, the science, the history. 10,000 years of human achievement erased in a single afternoon because 3 men in a submarine made a decision. He wonders sometimes if those 3 men, the captain, the political officer, the flotilla commander, would have made the same decision if they had known what would follow, if they could have seen the burning cities, the starving children, the collapse of civilization, the extinction of most of humanity. Would they still have turned those keys? But he knows the answer doesn't matter. The decision was made. The torpedo was fired, and everything after that was inevitable, as inexorable as gravity. By 1970, the Earth is a colder, darker, emptier place than it was in 1962. The nuclear winter is slowly moderating, but the planet has been fundamentally altered. Average global temperatures are still 20 degrees below pre-war norms. The atmospheric carbon load has been partially cleared, but ash and aerosols will remain in the stratosphere for decades more. The climate will not return to pre-war conditions within any human timeframe, perhaps not for centuries. The ecosystems have been simplified.
Biodiversity has collapsed. Most large animal species are extinct. Most plant species have been eliminated. What remains are the most hardy, adaptable, opportunistic species: rats, crows, certain grasses and weeds, cold water fish, seals, a few species of seabirds. The Earth will recover, eventually. Life is resilient. Given enough time, thousands or millions of years, evolution will fill the empty niches. Biodiversity will return. New ecosystems will emerge. But it will be a different Earth with different ecosystems, different species. The world that existed before October 27, 1962, is gone forever. And humanity, if it survives, will be a different species in every meaningful sense. The surviving populations have lost everything that made them modern humans. They have lost their technology, their knowledge, their culture, their history. They have been reduced to the most basic existence, barely distinguishable from their ancestors 20,000 years ago. Will they survive? Perhaps. The 2 million survivors are distributed across enough locations that some populations will likely persist. Will they rebuild civilization? Almost certainly not. Not in any time frame that matters. Rebuilding to even medieval levels of technology would require resources and knowledge they no longer possess. The easily accessible coal, oil, iron ore, and other resources that powered the first industrial revolution were consumed by the civilization that destroyed itself. The survivors have no way to access deep resources. They have no metallurgy. They cannot rebuild the technological base necessary for civilization. Humanity's chance at spacefaring civilization, at understanding the universe, at spreading beyond Earth, all of that is gone. The survivors on Haida-Gwaii and in scattered coastal communities across the world will live and die and pass on their genes, but they will never build cities, never fly, never reach for the stars. The universe is vast and indifferent. It does not care that one species on one small planet destroyed itself just as it was beginning to understand the cosmos. The stars continue their ancient dance. The galaxies rotate. The universe expands. And on a cold, dark world circling an average star, a handful of apes cling to life at the edge of extinction, all that remains of a species that once dreamed of infinity.
Echoes in the darkness, the world that never was. There are places scattered across the dead world where echoes of the old civilization remain. In the ruins of New York City, beneath layers of radioactive dust and ice, the infrastructure of human ambition sits frozen in time. The subway tunnels, where hundreds of thousands died in the first winter, are tombs now. The skeletal remains of the subway cars sit on their tracks, covered in frost. The bodies have long since decomposed or been consumed, but scraps of clothing remain: business suits, dresses, winter coats worn by people who were commuting home on October 27, 1962, and never arrived. In the vaults beneath what was once the Federal Reserve Bank, billions of dollars in paper currency and gold sit undisturbed. The money is worthless, has been worthless since the day the war began, but the gold remains valuable, in theory, pure elemental gold, uncorrupted by time, though there is no one left to value it. In the ruins of libraries and museums, frozen and buried, are the records of human achievement. The books are damaged by water and ice, slowly degrading, but much remains. First editions of Shakespeare, original scientific papers by Einstein and Curie, ancient manuscripts preserved in climate-controlled vaults, all of it inaccessible, slowly deteriorating, waiting for readers who will never come. The Library of Congress, built to withstand disasters, partially survived the nuclear strike on Washington. Deep in its reinforced vaults, protected from the initial blast and fire, are millions of volumes. The Declaration of Independence, encased in protective glass. The Gutenberg Bible. Lincoln's handwritten Gettysburg Address. The complete collected knowledge of the United States Congress, every bill, every debate, every committee hearing that seems so important in the old world. No one will ever read them again. The building is buried under rubble and snow. The entrances are impassable. Even if the survivors knew these treasures existed, and they don't, because the surviving populations are thousands of miles away from Washington, they have no way to retrieve them and no use for them. A book cannot be eaten. Knowledge cannot warm you. History cannot save you from starvation. In Geneva, the CERN particle accelerator sits frozen and dark. The scientists who worked there died in the nuclear strikes or the subsequent collapse. The massive instruments they built to probe the fundamental nature of reality are silent. The experiments that were running in October 1962 will never be completed. The questions they were trying to answer about the origin of mass, about the structure of the universe, about the first moments after the Big Bang, will never be answered by humanity. Perhaps another species will evolve intelligence on Earth millions of years from now, and will discover the ruins of CERN and wonder what it was. Perhaps they will deduce that the ancient apes who built it were trying to understand the cosmos. Perhaps they will honor humanity's memory by completing the work. Or perhaps the ruins will simply be geological curiosities, the purpose long forgotten. In orbit, satellites still circle the Earth. Most stopped functioning within days or weeks of the war, as solar panels became coated with ash, as components failed without ground support, as their orbits decayed. But some, in higher orbits, will remain, for decades or centuries. The communications satellites are silent, receiving no signals from Earth, transmitting to no one. The Telstar satellite, launched just months before the war, orbits serenely above a dead world. It was designed to relay television signals and telephone calls across the Atlantic. Now it circles eternally in silence, a monument to a species that dreamed of connection. In the Soviet Union, the ruins of the Kremlin sit beneath ice and snow. The red star that topped the highest tower has fallen and lies buried. The palaces of the czars, converted to museums of the revolution, are tombs now. The portraits of Lenin and Stalin, the heroic statues of workers and soldiers, the monuments to the Soviet achievement, all are frozen in time, commemorating a state that existed for less than 70 years and destroyed itself. The irony is too perfect for anyone to appreciate it. The Soviet Union, which claimed to represent the inevitable future of humanity, the scientific progression toward a worker's paradise, ended by helping to destroy all of human civilization. The United States, which believed it represented freedom and democracy and human dignity, ended by obliterating cities and populations. Both ideologies, both systems, both dreams, all equally futile, all equally complicit in annihilation. In China, the Forbidden City sits abandoned. The ancient palace complex, which housed emperors for 500 years and survived wars, revolutions, and upheavals, has survived once more. But there is no one to appreciate its survival. The elaborate carved dragons, the painted temples, the marble steps, all are covered in ice. The treasures within, ancient scrolls, jade sculptures, imperial robes, are all frozen in place, waiting for appreciation that will never come. The Great Wall of China, humanity's most ambitious pre-industrial construction project, stretches across the frozen landscape. It was built to keep out invaders from the north. It failed at that task repeatedly over the centuries. Now it stands as humanity's tombstone, a massive, pointless monument to a species that could mobilize millions of workers to build a wall, but couldn't prevent 3 men in a submarine from ending it all. In the Louvre, the Mona Lisa smiles enigmatically in the darkness. The painting survived the nuclear strikes. Paris was hit, but the Louvre's location spared it from direct destruction. The museum is buried under rubble and ice now, but deep in the climate-controlled vaults, Da Vinci's masterpiece endures. What is she smiling about? Scholars debated that question for centuries. Now the question is moot. There are no scholars. There is no debate. There is just a painting in the darkness, unseen, its meaning locked away forever with the civilization that treasured it. The pyramids of Giza, 4,500 years old, have outlasted the civilization that destroyed itself. The ancient Egyptians built for eternity, and they succeeded. Their monuments outlived not just their own civilization, but all of human civilization. The Sphinx still gazes across the desert, now frozen and covered in snow. It has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of religions, the evolution of human society from bronze to nuclear weapons. And now it witnesses nothing. The tourists are gone, the archaeologists are gone. The people who wondered at ancient achievements and tried to decode ancient mysteries, all gone. The Sphinx stares across an empty landscape toward a dark sky, eternal and meaningless. In museums around the world, in vaults and archives and libraries, in ruins and wreckage, the records of human civilization remain. Not just the grand achievements, the art and literature and science, but the mundane details, photographs of families on vacation, letters between lovers, children's drawings, shopping lists, tax returns, the accumulated detritus of 3 billion lives, frozen in time, preserved by the cold, waiting for interpretation that will never come. And beneath the ocean, in the darkness of the deep sea, lies submarine B-59. The vessel that started the war sits on the bottom, crushed by pressure, entombed in sediment. The bodies of the crew, Vasily Arkhipov, Maslenikov, and 75 others are gone, consumed by the deep-sea ecosystem. But the submarine itself will remain for centuries, perhaps millennia, until corrosion and geology erase it. If it could be found and examined, it would tell a story. The torpedo tube that launched the nuclear weapon, the authorization keys that were turned, the communications logs showing the increasing desperation of the crew, the final moments when they realized what they had done. But it will never be found. The survivors have no ships capable of deep-sea exploration. They have no technology to locate underwater wrecks. They have no interest in the question. The war for them is ancient history, assuming it's remembered at all, and its causes are irrelevant. What matters is fish, shelter, and survival. B-59 will rest undisturbed on the ocean floor, a secret monument to the moment when humanity crossed the threshold and could not return. There is a terrible loneliness to these abandoned places. The cities and buildings and monuments were created by humans for humans. They were meant to be seen, used, appreciated. They embodied human meaning, human purpose, human connection. Now they sit in darkness and cold, serving no purpose, meaning nothing, connecting no one. They are like words spoken in an empty room, like songs sung to no audience, like love letters written to the dead. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of the nuclear war. Not just the deaths.
The philosophical reckoning. What was lost? In the moments before the torpedo was fired, before the nuclear exchange began, before civilization ended, what was humanity? We were 7 million years of evolution. We were apes who learned to walk upright, to use tools, to control fire, to speak, to think, to wonder. We were the only species on Earth that could ask questions about its own existence, that could contemplate the universe, that could create art and science and philosophy. We were imperfect. We were violent, tribal, irrational. We committed atrocities. We enslaved each other. We waged wars over religion, ideology, and resources. We destroyed ecosystems. We drove species to extinction. We treated each other with cruelty that no other animal could match. But we were also capable of extraordinary beauty. We created Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and Shakespeare's plays. We built cathedrals and wrote poetry. We developed mathematics and science. We sent probes to other planets. We were beginning to understand the universe at its most fundamental levels. We were capable of love, of sacrifice, of compassion. Parents cared for their children.
people helped strangers. Societies, however imperfectly, tried to establish justice and protect the weak. We were capable of seeing beyond our immediate self-interest to care about abstract concepts like fairness, truth, and beauty. We were capable of learning and change. Slavery, once universal, was abolished. Democracy spread. Human rights expanded. Science advanced. We were getting better, slowly, imperfectly, but measurably better. And we were unique in the universe, as far as we knew. In all the vast cosmos, with its billions of galaxies and trillions of stars, we had found no evidence of any other species that could think, create, or wonder. We might have been alone, or we might have been one of millions of intelligent species. We didn't know. But we were here. We existed. We mattered, if only to ourselves. And then, on a Saturday afternoon in October 1962, we made a decision. Not humanity as a whole, just 3 men, in a submarine, under imaginable stress, making what they thought was the best choice in an impossible situation. They didn't intend to end civilization. They thought they were defending themselves, defending their country, following their orders. They thought war had already begun. They thought their choice was between fighting and surrendering. They were wrong. But they didn't know they were wrong. And by the time anyone realized they were wrong, it was too late. The tragedy of the nuclear war is not that it was inevitable. It wasn't. In our timeline, the same situation occurred, and Vasily Arkhipov said no. 1 man, 1 word, and humanity continued. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved through diplomacy. Kennedy and Khrushchev, both frightened by how close they came to war, established a nuclear hotline and pursued arms control. The nuclear war didn't have to happen. It happened because of a series of decisions, any one of which could have gone differently. If Kennedy had not approved the Bay of Pigs invasion, if Khrushchev had not placed missiles in Cuba, if the American destroyers had not used depth charges, if Savitsky had not been so exhausted and stressed, if Arkhipov had not been aboard, or if he had agreed instead of dissenting. 1,000 contingencies, any one of which could have changed the outcome. But they didn't. The decisions were made. The torpedo was fired. And everything after that followed with the inexorable logic of cascading catastrophe. This is the terror of living in the nuclear age, and we still live in it, in our timeline. The weapons exist. The doctrines exist. The capacity for one bad decision to end civilization exists. We survived the Cuban Missile Crisis by luck as much as by wisdom. And we've had other close calls since then, false alarms, miscommunications, accidents that could have triggered war, but didn't. We survived because people made the right choices at critical moments, but there's no guarantee they always will. There's no law of physics that prevents nuclear war. There's no divine intervention that protects humanity from its own weapons. There's just human decision-making, flawed and fallible, standing between civilization and annihilation. In the alternate timeline, 3 billion people died because 3 men made a choice. But those 3 men were not monsters. They were ordinary humans, placed in an extraordinary situation, doing what they thought was right. This is the horror of nuclear weapons. They don't require evil. They don't require malice. They only require fallibility, which is the human condition. What was lost when civilization ended? Everything. But also, nothing. The universe doesn't care that humanity destroyed itself. The stars continue their journeys. The laws of physics operate unchanged. From a cosmic perspective, the extinction of one species on one planet is utterly insignificant. But from a human perspective, the only perspective that matters to us, the loss is total. Every person who died in the nuclear fires, every child who never grew up, every relationship, every dream, every moment of joy or love or meaning, all erased. The greatest scientists who ever lived, who were on the verge of understanding quantum mechanics, relativity, the structure of the universe, dead. Their knowledge lost, their discoveries unmade.
The greatest artists, musicians, writers, silenced. Their future works uncreated, their beauty unrealized. And the ordinary people, the billions, who were simply living their lives, trying to make something meaningful of their brief existence, all terminated. Their stories unfinished, their potential unrealized. And the future, that vast, infinite possibility space of everything humanity might have become, collapsed to nothing. No space exploration, no discovery of alien life, no cure for aging or disease, no utopian future, no new philosophies or religions or art forms, no evolution beyond our current limitations. All of the potential futures, the futures where humanity spread across the galaxy, where we solve the mysteries of consciousness and the universe, where we transcended our limitations and became something greater, all erased in an instant. We were standing at the threshold of infinity, and we stepped backwards into oblivion. Or perhaps that's too dramatic. Perhaps the survivors will persist, will slowly rebuild, will eventually create a new civilization. Perhaps in 10,000 years, their descendants will rediscover metallurgy, agriculture, writing, science. Perhaps they'll find the ruins of our civilization and learn from our mistakes. Perhaps they'll build a better world than we did. But they won't be us. They'll be a new humanity, shaped by the crucible of near extinction, carrying forward almost nothing of our culture or knowledge. The thread of civilization that stretched back 10,000 years to the first agricultural settlements has been severed. If a new civilization arises, it will be starting over from the beginning. And the old world, our world, the cities and nations and art and science and all human achievement up to October 1962, that world is gone forever. In the end, perhaps the nuclear war revealed a fundamental truth about humanity. We are not as wise as we thought we were. We built weapons we could not control. We created systems we did not understand. We believed we could manage the ultimate destructive power, and we were wrong. The Greeks called it hubris, excessive pride leading to downfall. Humanity reached for godlike power and discovered we were still apes. Smart apes, tool-using apes, but apes nonetheless, capable of profound brilliance and profound stupidity, often simultaneously. We flew too close to the sun, and we burned. And now, in the aftermath, the survivors sit around fires on cold beaches and tell stories that no longer make sense, about a world that no longer exists, about people who dreamed of things that no longer matter. And the universe, indifferent and eternal, continues without us.
Closing reflection: the world we almost lost. 5.
This is the story of what did not happen. In our timeline, Vasily Arkhipov said no. The torpedo was not fired. The nuclear war did not begin. Humanity survived. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended on October 28, 1962, with a negotiated settlement. Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. Kennedy agreed not to invade Cuba and to remove American missiles from Turkey. Both sides stepped back from the brink. In the years that followed, Kennedy and Khrushchev established the nuclear hotline, a direct communication system to prevent future misunderstandings. They signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty. They began the slow process of arms control that eventually led to significant reductions in nuclear arsenals. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, but not by nuclear fire, by a single gunman in Dallas. Khrushchev was removed from power in 1964, but he lived to old age. The Cold War continued for decades, but never again came quite so close to ending humanity. The 3 billion people who died in our alternate timeline lived full lives in our reality. They had children and grandchildren. They pursued careers and dreams. They loved and thought and created and struggled. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives, never knowing how close they came to oblivion. The scientists continued their work. The artists continued creating.
The slow, imperfect progress of human civilization continued. We went to the moon. We built the internet. We decoded the human genome. We discovered planets around other stars. We're still here, still trying, still dreaming. But we live in a world where the weapons still exist, where the doctrines that almost destroyed us are still in place, where the same dynamics that created the Cuban Missile Crisis, great power rivalry, ideological conflict, arms races, still operate. We survived 1962 by luck as much as by wisdom, and we've had other close calls since then. In 1983, a Soviet early warning system falsely detected an American nuclear strike. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, judged it was a false alarm and did not report it up the chain of command. He was right. If he had been wrong, or if he had followed protocol, we might have had another October 1962. The weapons haven't gone away. The dangers haven't disappeared. We live every day with the possibility that human civilization could end, not because of an asteroid strike or a supervolcano or any natural catastrophe, but because of human fallibility. We are smart apes who built weapons that can destroy our own world. We are rational enough to understand the danger, but not rational enough to eliminate it. We are wise enough to fear extinction, but not wise enough to guarantee we'll prevent it. The story of what would have happened if the Cuban Missile Crisis went nuclear is not just an alternate history. It's a warning. It's a reminder of what we almost lost and what we still risk losing. Every day that we survive is a gift. Every day that nuclear weapons exist but are not used is a miracle of restraint and luck. Every day that we continue to exist as a species is a testimony to the humans like Vasily Arkhipov and Stanislav Petrov who made the right decision at the critical moment. But we cannot count on always having such heroes. We cannot count on always being lucky. We cannot count on always choosing wisely. The only way to guarantee we never experience the catastrophe described in this narrative is to eliminate the weapons that could cause it. As long as nuclear arsenals exist, as long as the doctrines of nuclear deterrence remain, as long as humans control weapons that could end civilization, we live with the possibility of our own extinction. Perhaps someday we will be wise enough to eliminate that possibility. Perhaps future generations will look back on the nuclear age the way we look back on other barbaric practices of our ancestors, with horror and incomprehension that we ever thought such things were acceptable. Or perhaps we will make the same mistake that the alternate timeline made. Perhaps 3 men, or 300 men, or 3,000 men will make a decision that seems reasonable at the time, but leads inexorably to the end of everything. We don't know which future we'll have. We don't know if humanity will survive another 1,000 years or another 1,000 days. We don't know if we are living at the beginning of an endless future of human achievement or in the final chapters before the last page. All we know is that we survived October 27, 1962. We survived because one man said no. And every day since then has been borrowed time. Time we almost didn't have. Time we might still lose. Time we should treasure because we know now how easily it could end. The world where the Cuban Missile Crisis went nuclear is a world that almost was. It is separated from our world by a single decision, a single word, a single moment when one man chose differently than his colleagues. That world is a warning. That world is a reminder. That world is what we carry with us every day as we navigate the dangers of living in a nuclear age. We almost died on October 27, 1962. We're still alive, and every moment after that dark day is a gift we should not take for granted. Perhaps the greatest lesson of that near miss is this: the world we have, imperfect as it is, struggling as it is infinitely precious, because it so easily could have been lost, because it still could be lost, because 3 billion lives and 10,000 years of civilization hang by the thinnest thread, the thread of human wisdom, restraint, and luck. And perhaps, if we remember how close we came to losing everything, we might finally be wise enough to step back from the weapons that could end everything. Perhaps. If we're lucky. If we're wise.
if we choose every day to say no to the fire that could consume us all.